John stands in the desert, watching in the distance as the sun begins to rise just above the horizon. The light hits off of the rocks and hills and desert floor that he knows so well. He spent most of his adult life there, in this lonely and isolated place. It's strange, but he started coming there when he was just a teenager because in this quietness, he could hear the voice that was calling him. And sitting on those rocks and listening, he felt a peace that he'd never felt in the cities or the towns. He kept coming back, learning more and more about this unique environment and how to live in it. He found the secret sources of water that only the animals knew. He found where to find food, how to make clothes that would make living in that space possible. But most of all, he found that he could hear the voice of God. And it rang in his heart and in his mind. He spent days just walking, exploring, learning all the cracks and crevices, the caves, and listening and listening. He enjoyed the solitude because he never felt alone. God was present. Who could ask for anything more? But that insistent voice in his soul kept calling him to do something different until he found himself coming again and again in closer contact with community. He'd go into town occasionally and he'd watch. And he'd watch the divisiveness and the selfishness. He'd watch people who didn't pay attention, who never listened to that voice of God that was so special to him, that so formed his life. It broke his heart. Sometimes he would go back to the desert, swearing he would never go in the city again. But God's voice kept calling him. Until finally he realized he had to respond. He had to make a new way for people to hear that voice, to know that love. And it was in the water of the river. He invited people to come and join him. And they began to come. At first, it was just one or two. Some others who also found joy in the desert. And some friends from his childhood who he ran into every now and then when he came in the cities. And they began to realize he had something important to share with them, and they listened. And they followed him. They followed him to the water. They followed him to new life. I think John's story is so important for us today because John makes a point of responding to what happens in his life so intentionally. He makes a point of stopping to listen, first of all, and then he makes a point of saying, and you can almost see him saying to himself, who am I called to be in this place now? At first, he was called to be a wanderer in the desert, a disciple of God, listening to God's voice. And then gradually he was called back into relationship with people to transform their lives. He was called to listen to what they were saying to him. He was called to listen to what God was saying to them. And then he responded. I think in this time of unrest that this is what God calls us to. We are first to listen to God's voice and who God calls us to be. And like John, we are called to reach out to others in love, which means, like John, we need to take that minute to stop and ask ourselves, who do I want to be in this moment, in this place? Am I the voice of love? Am I the voice of God's love? And am I opening that love to others by what I say and do? We have a lot of work to do right now. We are called as a people and as a church to change the world. God's commission to us has never stopped. And right now, our work is present. It's huge. And so I invite you to adopt some of the practices of John. Find a place where you can hear God's voice and listen for that. Find a place daily where you can stop and you can listen for that voice. And then I invite you to find a place where you can practice stopping and saying, in the midst of heated conversations, in the midst of fear and concerns, in the midst of this time, who am I called to be right now? I believe this practice is life-changing. I believe it will shape who we are. And I believe it will shape the world around us. Amen.